The royal breakfast. There was a frantic scurry among the palace servants when orders were received from the queen that a 24-foot giant must be seated with her majesty in the great ballroom within the next half-hour. The butler, an imposing personage named Mr. Tibbs, was in supreme command of all the palace servants, and he did the best he could in the short time available. A man does not rise to become the queen's butler unless he is gifted with extraordinary ingenuity, adaptability, versatility, dexterity, cunning, sophistication, sagacity, discretion, and a host of other talents that neither you nor I possess. Mr. Tibbs had them all. He was in the butler's pantry, sipping an early morning glass of light ale when the order reached him. In a split second, he made the following calculations in his head. If a normal 6-foot man requires a 3-foot high table to eat off, a 24-foot giant will require a 12-foot high table. And if a 6-foot man requires a chair with a 2-foot high seat, a 24-foot giant will require a chair with an 8-foot high seat. Everything, Mr. Tibbs told himself, must be multiplied by 4. 2 breakfast eggs must become 8. 4 rashers of bacon must become 16. 3 pieces of toast must become 12, and so on. These calculations about food were immediately passed on to Monsieur Papillon, the royal chef. Mr. Tibbs skimmed into the ballroom. Butlers don't walk, they skim over the ground, followed by a whole army of footmen. The footmen all wore knee-high breeches, and every one of them displayed beautifully rounded calves and ankles. There is no way you can become a royal footman unless you have a well-turned ankle. It is the first thing they look into when they are interviewed. Push the grand piano into the center of the room, Mr. Tibbs whispered. Butlers never raise their voices above the softest whisper. 4 footmen moved the piano. Now, fetch a large chest of drawers and put it on top of the piano, Mr. Tibbs whispered. 3 other footmen fetched a very fine Chippendale mahogany chest of drawers and placed it on top of the piano. That will be his chair, Mr. Tibbs whispered. It is exactly 8 feet off the ground. Now, we shall make a table upon which this gentleman may eat his breakfast in comfort. Fetch me 4 very tall grandfather clocks. There are plenty of them around the palace. Let each clock be 12 feet high. 16 footmen spread out around the palace to find the clocks. They were not easy to carry and required 4 footmen to each one. Place the 4 clocks in a rectangle 8 feet by 4 alongside the grand piano, Mr. Tibbs whispered. The footmen did so. Here are the footmen. So those are, imagine, fancy-looking servants, and I guess that's a well-turned ankle and calf. Those are breeches. I think Roald Dahl's hilarious that he's thinking about this type of stuff, and there is the famous, dexterous, adaptable Mr. Tibbs. Now, fetch me the young prince's ping-pong table, Mr. Tibbs whispered. The ping-pong table was carried in. Unscrew its legs and take them away, Mr. Tibbs whispered. This was done. Now, place the ping-pong table on top of the 4 grandfather clocks, Mr. Tibbs whispered. To manage this, the footmen had to stand on step-ladders. Mr. Tibbs stood back to survey the new furniture. None of this is in the classic style, he whispered, but it will have to do. He gave orders that a damask tablecloth should be draped. I don't know what a damask, but someone does, but a tablecloth should be draped over the ping-pong table, and in the end it looked really quite elegant after all. At this point, Mr. Tibbs seemed to hesitate. The footmen all stared at him, aghast. Butlers never hesitate, not even when they are faced with the most impossible problems. It is their job to be totally decisive at all times. That means making decisions decisive. Knives and forks and spoons, Mr. Tibbs was heard to mutter. Cutlery will be like little pins in his hands. Mr. Tibbs didn't hesitate for long. Tell the head gardener, he whispered, that I require immediately a brand new unused garden fork and also a spade, that's a shovel. And for a knife, we shall use the great sword hanging on the wall in the morning room, but clean the sword well first. It was last used to cut the head off of King Charles I, and there may still be a little dried blood on the blade. When all this had been accomplished, Mr. Tibbs stood near the center of the ballroom, casting his expert butler's eye over the scene. Had he forgotten anything? He certainly had. What about a coffee cup for the large gentleman? Fetch me, he whispered, the biggest jug you can find in the kitchen. A splendid 1-gallon porcelain water jug was brought in and placed on the giant's table beside the garden fork and the garden spade and the great sword. So much for the giant. Mr. Tibbs then had the footman move a small, delicate table and 2 chairs alongside the giant's table. This was for the Queen and for Sophie. The fact that the giant's table and chair towered above the smaller table simply could not be helped, because usually the royalty is at a higher level, even when they stand, and like the throne is elevated, so royalty always sit higher, but that's impossible with a giant. All these arrangements were only just completed when the Queen, now fully dressed in a trim skirt and cashmere cardigan, entered the ballroom holding Sophie by the hand. A pretty little blue dress that had once belonged to one of the princesses had been found for Sophie, and to make her look prettier still, the Queen had picked up a superb sapphire brooch. That's like a type of pin. A sapphire brooch from her dressing table and pinned it onto the left side of Sophie's chest. The big friendly giant followed behind them, but he had an awful time getting in through the door. He had to squeeze himself through on his hands and knees, with 2 footmen pushing him from behind and 2 pulling from the front. But he had got through in the end. He had removed his black cloak and got rid of his trumpet, and was now wearing his ordinary, simple clothes. As he walked across the ballroom, he had to stoop quite a lot to avoid hitting the ceiling. Because of this, he failed to notice an enormous crystal chandelier. Crash went his head right into the chandelier. A shower of glass fell upon the poor BFG. "Gunghummers and bogswinkles," he cried. "What was that?" "It was Louis XV, the Queen said, looking slightly put out. That's a famous French king. "He's never been in a house before," Sophie said. We'll stop there.